I never saw the strike that crippled our ship. None of us did. The Mercator Gloriana was a simple bulk freighter, plying the outer reaches of the Mandragora sector with agricultural tithe shipments. We carried nothing of true value, nothing worth the attention of those who came for us. Perhaps that was precisely why we were chosen. The ship groaned as I pressed my ear against the rusted bulkhead, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire and screaming that echoed through the Vox system. The captain had ordered us to secure the secondary cargo bays, but that had been nearly 2 hours ago. Now the Vox channels carried only static, punctuated occasionally by a wet gurgle or a voice begging for a mercy that would never come. I was a simple voidsman, third class, the kind who spends his life maintaining coolant pipes and replacing corroded wiring in forgotten maintenance shafts. I knew nothing of combat beyond the mandatory drills that no one took seriously. But I had survived 30 standard years aboard void vessels, and I knew when a ship was dying. The Gloriana shuddered violently, and emergency lumens flickered to life as the main power grid failed. In that moment of illumination, I saw the terror on the faces of my fellow crewmen. There were 12 of us huddled in the storage compartment, clutching improvised weapons, listening to death creep closer deck by deck. "We need to reach the savior pods," Hollins whispered, his voice cracking. He was senior to me by a decade, but the fear had reduced him to a trembling shadow. "The pods are 3 decks up," I replied. "Whatever is out there stands between us and escape." The deck lurched again, and I felt the distinctive vibration of atmospheric entry. We were not meant to make planetfall. The Gloriana was a void vessel, never designed to enter a gravity well. Someone had overridden the navigational systems, forcing us toward the agri-moon we had been orbiting. Whether it was a desperate act by our command crew or the long, deliberate choice of our attackers, I could not know. The storage room door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, causing everyone to raise their makeshift weapons. Relief washed over us when Engincia Thale stepped through, his mechadendrites writhing in agitation. "They have taken the bridge," he said, his augmetic voice box rendering his words in a flat monotone that somehow made them more terrifying. "They are not interested in prisoners." "Who are they?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Thale's red-lensed eyes flickered. "Night Lords." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Not pirates or raiders or even the dark Eldar that haunted the nightmares of all voidfarers. Night Lords, traitor Astartes, the Emperor's finest sons turned to darkness 10,000 years ago, who now returned from the warp to inflict terror upon the Imperium they once served. "We are making emergency planetfall on Agrippina Minor," Thale continued. "Impact in approximately 22 minutes. I have calculated that this section has a 17% chance of remaining intact upon landing. 17%. Better odds than facing what stalked the corridors of our dying ship. I will never forget the impact, the screaming of twisted metal, the feeling of weightlessness as gravity systems failed completely during our final descent, the brutal force that slammed me against a bulkhead, shattering my collarbone and 3 ribs, the darkness that followed. When consciousness returned, I found myself pinned beneath a fallen cargo stanchion, the taste of blood thick in my mouth. Around me, the storage compartment had been transformed into a tangle of debris and broken bodies. The only light came from small electrical fires that had broken out in the exposed wiring. I did not know then that I was the only survivor in that room. I did not know that my true ordeal was only beginning. I did not understand that I had been marked, not for a quick death like my more fortunate crewmates, but for a lesson in fear that would stretch across 7 terrible days. The Night Lords were not simply killing, they were hunting, and somehow I had become their chosen prey. It took nearly an hour to free myself from the wreckage. Every movement sent lances of pain through my broken body, but fear provided strength that I never knew I possessed. The ship had broken apart during our descent, and the storage compartment now lay partially exposed to Agrippina Minor's atmosphere. Through the torn hull, I could see an alien sky, deep purple with streaks of amber where the system's distant sun was setting. I found Hollins impaled on a shard of bulkhead, his eyes still open in shock. Enginsia Thale was little more than a tangle of metal and flesh, his augmetics still sparking feebly. The others had been crushed or broken by the impact. I alone remained. It was Hollins's coat that saved me. The thick waxed utility jacket was stained with his blood, but it would provide some protection against the elements. I took his boots as well, as mine had been torn apart in the crash. His belt contained a standard Imperial Navy utility knife, a canteen, and a small, malfunctioning low lamp that still produced a weak beam when shaken vigorously. I stood at the ragged edge of the hull breach, staring out at the landscape of Agrippina Minor. The Agrimoon had once been a productive feeder world, supplying grain and livestock to the hive cities of Mandragora Tertius. Now, it stretched before me as a wasteland of abandoned cultivation fields and distant, darkened habitation units. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and rotting vegetation, along with something acrid that I could not identify. Smoke, perhaps, from other sections of the ship that burned across the landscape. Or perhaps something worse. I knew I could not stay with the wreckage. The Night Lords would surely hunt for survivors. My only hope was to find an Imperial outpost, a functioning Vox array, something that might allow me to signal for rescue. The fading light of day would provide some cover for my escape, but I had no illusions about what awaited me in the darkness. As I prepared to climb down the twisted metal of the hull, something caught my eye. A symbol, freshly painted in what appeared to be still wet blood on the inner wall of the compartment. A stylized winged skull with lightning bolts emanating from its eye sockets, the mark of the 8th Legion, and beneath it, a single word scrawled in Gothic script, "Run." They knew someone had survived. They had already been here, surveying the wreckage. This was not random violence or mindless slaughter. This was sport. With trembling hands, I secured my meager supplies and began my descent into the alien landscape, keenly aware that eyes were watching me from somewhere in the gathering darkness. I did not know then how long I would survive or what horrors awaited me. I only knew that I must keep moving or face a fate worse than death. The terrain surrounding the crash site was uneven, a patchwork of once cultivated fields now gone to seed and wild. The ship had carved a massive furrow through the landscape, scattering debris for what must have been kilometers. In the distance, I could see larger sections of the Gloriana burning, sending columns of black smoke into the darkening sky. My first instinct was to put as much distance between myself and the wreckage as possible. The Night Lords would surely begin their hunt there. I oriented myself using the setting sun and began moving perpendicular to the crash trajectory toward what appeared to be a tree line approximately 2 kilometers away. Each step was agony. My broken ribs shifted with every breath, and my shattered collarbone sent white-hot spikes of pain down my arm whenever I moved too suddenly. Yet fear drove me forward, one stumbling foot after another, across the uneven ground. I had covered perhaps half the distance to the trees when I heard it. A sound so subtle that at first I believed it to be my imagination. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like the sound of ceramite boots moving deliberately across hard ground. It came from behind me, some distance away but closing. I did not look back. Some primal instinct told me that to turn, to acknowledge the hunter, would seal my fate. Instead, I quickened my pace as much as my broken body would allow, fighting the urge to break into a panicked run. Running would only hasten my end. The clicking stopped, and for one hopeful moment, I thought perhaps I had imagined it. Then a voice called out, amplified by a voxcaster yet somehow still intimate, as though the speaker stood at my shoulder whispering directly into my ear. "Your fear has a scent, little one. Like overripe fruit, sweet and cloying. We can taste it on the air." The voice was deep, resonant, yet wrong somehow. It contained harmonics and undertones that no human vocal cords could produce. It was the voice of something that had once been a man but had been transformed by 10 millennia of hatred and warp exposure into something altogether different. 17 survivors scattered across this worthless moon. The voice continued. "By dawn, There will be 16. By week's end, none. But who shall be first to feed our hunger? I reached the tree line as the last light faded from the sky. The forest was unlike any I had seen before, with pale, bone-white trunks that rose like pillars into a canopy of deep crimson leaves. The undergrowth was sparse, allowing me to move between the trees with relative ease despite my injuries. In the darkness, I activated Hollins's low lamp, its weak beam barely illuminating the ground before my feet. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps, a small mercy as I ventured deeper into the unknown terrain. Hours passed as I pushed myself forward, driven by the certainty that to stop was to die. The twin moons of Agrippina Minor rose, bathing the forest in pale, silvery light that filtered through the canopy in ghostly patterns. In that ethereal illumination, I began to notice details that had escaped me earlier. The trees were not natural growths, but cultivated specimens, planted in two perfect rows that had only begun to succumb to wildness after years of neglect. This had been an orchard once, part of the Agri-Moon's carefully managed ecosystem. Now it stood abandoned, the trees unpruned, their fruit unharvested. And there was fruit. Hanging from the higher branches, pale orbs that gleamed in the moonlight like bleached skulls. I was desperately thirsty, my canteen already half empty. But something about those ghostly growths filled me with instinctive dread. This was not a place of nourishment, but of slow poison. My suspicions were confirmed when I stumbled upon the first body. It lay curled at the base of one of the larger trees, desiccated and partially mummified by the dry air. Not a victim of the crash or the Night Lords, but someone who had died here long ago, when the Agri-Moon was still inhabited. Clutched in its withered hand was one of the pale fruits, a single bite taken from its flesh. I wondered what catastrophe had befallen this once productive moon. Disease? Warp contamination? Administrative neglect? The Imperium was vast, and worlds could be forgotten through simple clerical error, their populations left to fend for themselves until they eventually perished. The sound came again, closer now. That deliberate, unhurried clicking of ceramite on hard ground. They had followed me into the forest, tracking me with senses far superior to my own. I extinguished the low lamp immediately and pressed myself against one of the bone-white trunks, trying to control my ragged breathing. "We can hear your heart beating, little one," the voice called, echoing among the trees. Such a fragile mechanism, so easy to stop. I remained frozen, afraid even to swallow lest the sound give away my position. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the entire forest had become the hunter's mouth. There is no escape from the sons of Nostramo. We were bred in darkness, shaped by fear. It is the currency in which we trade, the sustenance that feeds our souls. Something moved in the undergrowth to my right, too large to be any natural denizen of this twisted orchard. I caught a glimpse of midnight blue armor, of cruel talons that gleamed silver in the moonlight. And then it was gone, vanishing among the trees with a grace that belied its massive size. They were toying with me. They could have ended my life at any moment, but that would have provided them with no entertainment, no sustenance for their twisted appetites. I was not prey to be quickly dispatched, but a source of terror to be cultivated and harvested. When I felt certain that they had withdrawn, at least temporarily, I continued my journey through the forest. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between myself and my pursuers. But as the night wore on, I began to see signs of civilization through the thinning trees, the silhouettes of buildings against the starry sky. By the time dawn broke over Agrippina Minor, I stood at the edge of the forest, looking down upon what had once been a thriving agricultural community. Hab blocks rose like monoliths from the center of vast, overgrown fields. Storage silos and processing facilities stood silent, their purpose long forgotten. And in the distance, rising above it all, the distinctive shape of an imperial shrine, its spires reaching toward the heavens in supplication to the god emperor. If any place on this forsaken moon held the promise of salvation, it would be there. Imperial shrines often contained vox arrays for communicating with passing ecclesiastical vessels. There might be emergency supplies, weapons, perhaps even a functioning shuttle in some forgotten maintenance bay. As the pale sun climbed higher in the purple sky, I began my approach to the abandoned settlement, hope and dread warring in my heart. Hope that I might find the means to escape this nightmare. Dread that I was walking into a carefully prepared trap. Little did I know that both my hope and dread were justified, and that the cruelest lessons of the Night Lords were yet to be learned. I approached the abandoned settlement with caution, moving from one patch of cover to another, constantly scanning my surroundings for signs of my pursuers. The morning light revealed the extent of the decay that had claimed this once productive community. The hab blocks were crumbling, their facades stained with the residue of countless storms. The vast fields that surrounded them had gone wild, choked with invasive vegetation that had overtaken the carefully cultivated crops. As I drew closer, I began to notice disturbing details. The main thoroughfare leading into the settlement was lined with what I initially took to be decorative posts. It was only as I approached that I realized their true nature. Bodies, desiccated by time and the elements, had been impaled on metal spikes and left to rot. Some were recent, their flesh still sloughing from yellowed bone. Others were ancient, little more than skeletons held together by scraps of leathery skin. This was not the work of neglect or abandonment. This was deliberate, a message written in suffering and death. The Night Lords had been here before, perhaps many times, using this forgotten moon as their private hunting ground. I skirted the edge of the settlement, avoiding the main entrance with its grisly markers. The back of the largest hab block had partially collapsed, creating a jagged opening that might allow me to enter unobserved. I waited, watching for any sign of movement, before darting across the open ground and slipping into the shadowed interior of the building. The smell hit me immediately, a thick miasma of rot and human waste that spoke of recent habitation, not by the original colonists, but by someone or something. The interior was dark, the few windows long ago boarded up or broken and covered with scavenged materials. I activated the low lamp again, its weak beam revealing a scene of squalor and desperation. The ground floor had been transformed into a makeshift camp. Bedrolls fashioned from tattered cloth lay scattered across the floor. A fire pit had been constructed in what was once a communal gathering area, the ceiling above it blackened with soot. Crude implements, fashioned from scavenged metal and wood, suggested that people had been living here, surviving in the shadow of horror. "Hello?" I called softly, immediately regretting the sound. My voice echoed through the empty space, seeming to multiply and grow until it felt as though 100 voices called out in question. No answer came, save for the skittering of small creatures in the walls and the distant groan of the building settling. I moved deeper into the hab block, searching for signs of recent activity, for anything that might help me understand what had happened here. I found my answers on the second floor, in what had once been a dormitory for agricultural workers. The room was large, with rows of simple cots now rotted and collapsed, but it was the walls that told the story. Every surface had been covered with frantic scrawls, some in paint, others carved directly into the plaster, and still others written in what could only be dried blood. "They come at night. The Emperor has abandoned us. No escape from the sons of Curze. They feed on fear." Interspersed with these desperate messages were crude representations of the Night Lord's iconography, the winged skull with lightning bolts, drawn over and over as though in a trance. Some areas of the wall had been defaced with more disturbing imagery, scenes of torture and mutilation rendered with the skill of someone who had witnessed such atrocities firsthand. In the center of the room, arranged in a circle, were 13 chairs. 12 were occupied by corpses in various states of decay, their wrists and ankles bound to the chair frames with rusted wire. The 13th chair, positioned so that it faced all the others, was empty save for a folded piece of parchment. With trembling hands, I lifted the parchment and unfolded it. The message inside was written in a flowing, elegant script that seemed incongruous with the horror surrounding me. We left one alive to tell the story. She has already fulfilled her purpose. Now you shall take her place, Voidsman. Your tale will be different, but no less instructive." The message was signed with a single lightning bolt, drawn with such precision that it seemed to flicker with actual electricity on the page. A noise from below startled me, the unmistakable sound of ceramite boots on the hab block's ground floor. No longer trying to conceal their presence, my hunters moved openly through the building, allowing me to hear their approach. I looked desperately around the room for another exit, finding a service door half hidden behind one of the rotted cots. I fled through the opening, finding myself in a narrow maintenance corridor that ran the length of the building. Emergency lighting strips, powered by ancient backup generators, provided just enough illumination to navigate by. I ran as quietly as my injuries would allow, each breath sending fresh stabs of pain through my broken ribs. The corridor ended at a reinforced door, its locking mechanism long since failed. Beyond it lay the settlement's central plaza, dominated by the towering form of the imperial shrine. In the full light of day, I could see that the shrine had not escaped the attention of the Night Lords. Its once pristine facade was defaced with the same winged skull motif, painted on a scale that must have required scaffolding and vast quantities of pigment or blood. I had no choice but to cross the exposed plaza. Behind me, I heard the service door crash, open, followed by the measured tread of ceramite boots. They were not running. They had no need to hurry. I sprinted across the open space, my broken body screaming in protest, fueled only by the primal need to escape. The massive doors of the shrine stood partially open, a sliver of darkness that promised if not safety, then at least concealment. As I reached the midpoint of the plaza, a voice rang out, the same resonant, unnatural tone that had haunted me through the forest. "Run, little one. Your fear gives wings to your feet. It is glorious to behold." I did not look back. I could not bear to see what followed me. Instead, I focused entirely on the shrine entrance, now only 30 meters away. 20. 10. I slipped through the gap in the doors and found myself in the cavernous nave of the shrine. Shafts of colored light pierced the gloom from high stained glass windows, illuminating motes of dust that hung suspended in the still air. The shrine appeared untouched by the profanity that marked the settlement outside, as though some lingering power of the Emperor still protected this sacred space. Without pausing, I moved deeper into the shrine, past rows of wooden pews, beneath the stern gaze of statues depicting imperial saints and heroes. The main altar stood at the far end of the nave, dominated by a massive aquila fashioned from gold and precious stones, its wings spread in eternal vigilance. Behind the altar, a small door led to what I hoped would be the shrine's administrative offices, where a vox array might be located. I reached the door just as I heard the main entrance to the shrine swing open, the ancient hinges protesting with a scream of tortured metal. "Even here, you are not beyond our reach," the voice called, echoing from the vaulted ceiling. "The corpse god cannot protect you, little one. He failed to protect the others. He will fail to protect you." I slipped through the door and sealed it behind me, though I harbored no illusions that a Konzleish, simple wooden barrier would long delay a space marine. The corridor beyond was narrow, lined with small offices once used by the shrine's clergy. Most were empty, stripped of anything useful long ago. But at the end of the hall, a reinforced door bore the distinctive sigil of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, an astropathic relay station. Every major imperial facility maintained one, allowing for communication across the vast distances of space through the Emperor's tarot and the psychic abilities of trained astropaths. If it remained functional, if by some miracle an astropath still lived, I might be able to send a distress signal. The door was locked, but decades of neglect had weakened its frame. With desperate strength, I threw my shoulder against it, ignoring the white-hot agony from my broken collarbone. On the third impact, the frame splintered, and I tumbled into the darkened room beyond. The stench hit me immediately, a reek of human waste and rotting flesh so powerful that I retched, bringing up the meager contents of my empty stomach. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw the source of the smell. An astropath sat in a sanctified throne at the center of the room, surrounded by the arcane equipment of his office. His withered body was held upright by a complex framework of wires and tubes, some of which penetrated his flesh directly. His head had been shaved and fitted with a crown of copper and silver, from which cables snaked to a vox array that dominated one wall of the chamber. He was alive. Emperor, help me, he was still alive. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and as I approached, his head turned toward me, though the empty sockets where his eyes should have been saw nothing. The ritual blinding that all astropaths undergo had been performed long ago, but something, had kept him alive far beyond his natural span. "They come," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the room. "Always. They come. To feed." "I need to send a message," I said, moving closer to the vox array. "A distress signal. Can you help me?" The astropath's lipless mouth stretched in what might have been a smile or a grimace of pain. "No messages leave this place. They made certain of that. They want no interference in their hunting ground." "There must be something we can do," I insisted, examining the vox array for any sign that it might still function. "Some way to call for help." "Help?" the astropath echoed, the word seeming to amuse him. "There is no help for Agrippina Minor. The Night Lords claimed it long ago, when the Emperor's servants abandoned us to our fate. Now it serves as their playground, their menagerie of fear." A thunderous crash echoed from the corridor outside. They had breached the shrine's administrative area and were methodically checking each room. "We had minutes at most." "How long?" I asked, turning back to the astropath. "How long have they been hunting here?" "Years. Decades. Time loses meaning when existence is only suffering." His skeletal hand reached out, beckoning me closer. "But I have seen them, studied them, learned their weaknesses." Hope flared in my chest, a dangerous emotion in such dire circumstances. "Tell me, please." The astropath's hand closed around my wrist with surprising strength. "They cannot abide the light," he whispered urgently. "Not the physical light of stars or lamps, but the light of the Emperor's truth. Their souls are shadows, and truth burns them like acid." Before I could ask what he meant, the door to the astropathic chamber exploded inward, reduced to splinters by a single blow from a powered gauntlet. Silhouetted in the doorway stood a figure from humanity's darkest nightmares. The Night Lord towered nearly 3 meters tall, his midnight blue power armor adorned with flayed human skin and decorated with screaming faces crafted from the bones of his victims. His helmet was a work of terrifying art, fashioned to resemble a leering, demonic visage with eyes that glowed a baleful red in the dimness of the chamber. "A touching reunion," the Night Lord said, his voice the same that had haunted me since the crash. The blind messenger and the lost voidsman, sharing final confidences before the end. He stepped into the room, moving with a predator's grace that belied his enormous size. In one hand, he carried a wicked-looking flaying knife, its edge glinting in the dim light. In the other, a shock maul that crackled with lethal energy. "I am Garax the Skinless, once of the 10th Company, now servant of the Night Haunter's legacy," he announced, as though making a formal introduction at some perverse court. "And you, little ones, have provided me with most satisfying entertainment." The astropath's grip on my wrist tightened, his bony fingers digging into my flesh. "The light," he hissed, too quietly for even the enhanced senses of the Space Marine to detect. "Speak the truth that they fear to hear." I did not understand his meaning, but in that moment, facing certain death at the hands of a monster who had once been the Emperor's finest warrior, I found myself reciting the words that had been drilled into me since childhood, the catechism that every Imperial citizen learns. "The Emperor protects," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "His light illuminates the darkness, his will guides the faithful, his strength shields the righteous." Garax tilted his helmet to one side, the gesture almost curious. prayer will not save you, little one. Your corpse god sits immobile on his golden throne, blind to your suffering, deaf to your pleas." But I continued, the words flowing from me not in fear but in defiance. "Though the darkness surrounds us, his light burns eternal. Though enemies beset us, his vigilance never falters. Though death claims us, in his name we live forever." The astropath joined me, his raspy voice harmonizing with mine in the ancient litany. As we spoke, something extraordinary happened. The copper and silver crown upon his head began to glow with a soft golden light, and the vox array behind him hummed to life, its ancient machinery awakening from decades of dormancy. Garax took a step backward, his massive frame suddenly tense. "Silence your blasphemy," he snarled, all pretense of calm sadism vanishing. "You know not what forces you tamper with." But we did not stop. The words of the Imperial Creed poured from us, gaining strength and conviction with each syllable. The light emanating from the astropath's crown grew brighter, bathing the chamber in a warm golden glow that seemed to push back the shadows. Garax raised his shock maul, preparing to strike us down, but hesitated as the light touched his armor. Where it fell upon the midnight blue ceramite, the surface began to smoke and bubble, as though exposed to powerful acid. "Impossible," he growled, retreating another step. "The warp is our domain, not yours. The powers of the immaterium answer to chaos, not order." The astropath's voice rose to a shout, drowning out my own. "The Emperor's light shines even in the darkest places. His truth burns away falsehood. His justice finds all who betray him." The Vox array erupted with energy, golden lightning arcing from its ancient machinery to the crown upon the astropath's head. His body convulsed, back arching in what might have been agony or ecstasy, as he became a conduit for something far greater than himself. In that moment, I understood what was happening. This was not simply a Vox array, it was a psychic amplifier, designed to boost the astropath's abilities across vast distances. And now, filled with the fervor of true belief, the astropath was using it to channel something that the Night Lords could not face. Faith, pure, unalloyed faith in the Emperor of mankind. Garax let out a sound that was part scream, part snarl, as the golden light intensified, stripping away the flayed skin that adorned his armor, revealing the corrupted first of ceramite beneath. He staggered backward, raising one arm to shield his helmet's eye lenses from the searing radiance. "This changes nothing," he hissed, his voice distorted by pain. "You are still alone on this moon, still our prey. This moment of defiance only makes the hunt more satisfying." With those final words, he turned and fled the chamber, his massive form moving with desperate speed. The golden light pursued him, flooding the corridor outside, casting no shadows as it spread through the shrine. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the Vox array fell silent, and the astropath slumped in his throne, the crown upon his head now dull and lifeless. I rushed to his side, but it was too late. The effort had consumed him entirely, burning out what remained of his mortal form in one final act of devotion. He had given his life to save mine, to grant me a reprieve from the hunt, but I harbored no illusions about what would follow. Garax had retreated, but he would return, perhaps with others of his kind. And when he did, he would be merciless in his vengeance. Yet in that moment of grace, I realized something that gave me strength. The Night Lords fed on fear, drew power from the terror they inspired. But there was something they feared as well, something that could hurt them despite their transhuman physiology and warp-touched souls. Faith, truth, light. I knew then what I must do. Not simply survive, but bear witness. Become the light that burns away darkness, not through physical strength, but through the power of belief and the courage to face horror without surrendering to despair. As I left the astropathic chamber, navigating the now empty corridors of the shrine, I made a silent vow. I would not be merely prey in their twisted game. I would become something they did not expect, something they could not easily understand, a witness to their atrocities, a voice that would not be silenced by fear, a truth-bearer in a realm of lies. Little did I know how severely that resolve would be tested in the days to come, as Garax and his brethren resumed their hunt with renewed fury and cruel invention. But for that brief moment, standing in the empty shrine with the first stirrings of true purpose in my heart, I felt something I had thought lost forever in the wreckage of the Gloriana: hope. I spent that night in the uppermost spire of the shrine, a bell tower that offered both concealment and a vantage point from which to observe the settlement below. The climb had been agonizing, each step up the narrow, spiraling staircase sending fresh waves of pain through my broken body. But pain was preferable to what awaited me if I remained within reach of the Night Lords. From my elevated position, I watched as darkness fell over Agrippina Minor. The twin moons rose, casting their silvery light over the abandoned hab blocks and overgrown fields. And in that pale illumination, I witnessed a procession that chilled my blood despite the relative warmth of the night air. They emerged from the shadows one by one, massive armored figures moving with deliberate grace through the ruined settlement. There were 7 of them, each bearing the distinctive midnight blue armor of the Night Lords, each adorned with grisly trophies harvested from their victims. They converged on the central plaza, forming a circle around a pile of debris that I had not noticed during my earlier flight across the open space. With methodical precision, they arranged the debris into a pyre, adding what appeared to be the bodies of my fellow crewmen from the Gloriana. I recognized Holland's distinctive red hair, the mechadendrites of Enginsia Thale, the gold braid on the sleeve of Captain Harrow. They had recovered the dead from the wreckage, not out of any respect for the fallen, but for some darker purpose. One of the Night Lords, taller than the others and bearing a cloak of what appeared to be flayed faces stitched together, raised his hand. Even from my distant perch, I recognized Garax, his armor still bearing the marks of the astropath's psychic assault. At his signal, another Night Lord stepped forward, carrying a flamer. With a burst of promethium, the pyre was ignited, flames leaping skyward as the bodies of my crewmates began to burn. The Night Lords formed a circle around the blaze, their helmets removed to reveal faces that had once been human but had been transformed by warp exposure and their own twisted devotion into something monstrous. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes that glowed with an unholy light in the darkness. They began a chant in a language I did not recognize, their voices forming a discordant harmony that echoed across the abandoned settlement. The flames of the pyre shifted from orange to a sickly green, casting the gathered traitors in an eldritch light that emphasized their inhuman aspects. I realized with growing horror that this was no simple disposal of corpses. This was a ritual, a sacrifice to dark powers that I dared not contemplate. As their chanting reached a crescendo, the flames surged upward, forming patterns in the smoke that hurt my eyes to look upon, symbols of the warp, of chaos, of madness given form. And within those patterns, I saw faces, the tortured expressions of my dead crewmates, their souls somehow bound to this unholy ceremony. Garax raised his arms, his voice rising above the others. "Feed, brothers, on the fear that lingers in cooling flesh. Taste the terror of their final moments. Let it strengthen us for the hunt to come." The Night Lords inhaled deeply, as though breathing in the smoke from the pyre, their eyes closing in what appeared to be ecstasy. They were feeding, not on the physical remains, but on something more ephemeral, more valuable to their twisted appetites. I turned away, unable to watch the desecration of my former companions. When I looked back, the ritual had concluded, the pyre now burning with normal flames once more. The Night Lords had dispersed, vanishing back into the shadows of the ruined settlement, leaving only Garax standing before the fire. He looked up, his gaze unerringly finding my hiding place in the bell tower. Even at this distance, I could see the cruel smile that split his pallid features. "Rest while you can, little witness," his voice carried to me, amplified by some arcane technology in his armor. "Tomorrow, we begin again. Tomorrow, you learn the next lesson." With that promise hanging in the night air, he too disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my fear and the distant light of the burning pyre. I spent a restless night in the bell tower, dozing fitfully, startled awake by every sound that echoed through the abandoned shrine. By dawn, exhaustion had settled into my bones, joining the constant pain of my injuries to create a fog that clouded my thoughts and slowed my reactions. I knew I could not remain in the shrine. They had found me there once. They would find me again. My only hope was to keep moving, to find another place of concealment before the hunt resumed in earnest. As the first light of morning filtered through the louvered openings of the bell tower, I made my way back down the spiral staircase. My descent was slower than my panicked climb had been, allowing me to notice details that had escaped me before. The walls of the stairwell were covered with carvings, the devotional work of generations of faithful, but interspersed among the imperial prayers and symbols were newer markings, crude renderings of the Night Lord's iconography scratched into the stone with what appeared to be desperate haste. And beneath these, messages from those who had sought shelter here before me. They can smell fear. Do not run. They enjoy the chase. The eyes are the windows to terror. Pray for a quick death. The messages grew more frantic, more deranged, as I descended, telling the story of minds unraveling in the face of unrelenting horror. By the time I reached the main level of the shrine, the walls were a palimpsest of madness, layer upon layer of desperate warnings and broken prayers. I moved cautiously through the nave, staying close to the walls, using the shadows cast by massive columns as cover. The shrine seemed empty, the silence broken only by the occasional settling of ancient stonework and the distant cry of some native avian species. At the main entrance, I paused, peering through a narrow gap in the massive doors. The plaza outside was deserted, the ashes of last night's pyre scattered by the morning breeze. Beyond the plaza, the hab blocks stood silent, their windows like empty eye sockets, staring blindly at the purple sky. I had no plan beyond putting distance between myself and the shrine, finding some new hiding place where I might survive another day. Perhaps, if I was extraordinarily fortunate, I might discover a functioning communications array or even a small shuttle capable of breaking orbit. Such hopes were futile, I knew. The Night Lords would not have maintained this hunting ground for so long if escape was possible, but hope, no matter how irrational, was all that kept me moving. I slipped through the gap in the doors and darted across the plaza, staying low, moving as quickly as my injuries would allow. I headed for a narrow alley between two of the larger hab blocks, a route that would take me toward the outskirts of the settlement and perhaps to the wilderness beyond. I was halfway across the plaza when I heard it, the distinctive sound of a bolt pistol being cocked, the whine of its power cell charging. I froze, my body tensing for the impact that would end my life. "Turn around, little witness," a voice commanded, different from Garax's, but no less terrifying. "Let me see the fear in your eyes." Slowly, I obeyed, turning to face my executioner. The Night Lord stood at the top of the shrine steps, his armor a patchwork of midnight blue ceramite, and what appeared to be human skin, cured and stretched over the plates like macabre decoration. His helmet was fashioned to resemble a screaming face, the mouth open in eternal agony. "I am Vorax the Flayer," he said, descending the steps with measured tread, "and you have been chosen for a singular honor." "I will not run," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I will not give you the satisfaction of the chase." Vorax laughed, the sound like rusted metal scraping against stone. "So the prey believes it understands the hunter. How amusing," he continued his advance, bolt pistol trained on my chest. At this range, the mass-reactive shell would reduce my torso to a red mist, leaving nothing for the Medicae servitors to piece back together had there been any to try. "The chase is but one movement in the symphony of fear," Vorax continued. "There is also anticipation, revelation, despair. We shall experience them all together, you and I." He stopped a few paces away, close enough that I could see the details of his grotesque armor. The faces stretched across his pauldrons were not random victims but bore a striking resemblance to one another. A family, perhaps, their features preserved in the moment of their greatest terror. "You wonder about the shrine," Vorax said, his helmet tilting slightly to one side. "About the astropath, about the light that drove Garax away." I said nothing, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. It was a trick, little witness. A moment of psychic defiance, nothing more. The corpse god does not reach this place. His light does not penetrate the darkness we have cultivated here. Then why did Garax flee? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity despite the danger. Vorax made a sound that might have been amusement. Garax is young by our standards. Merely 3 centuries in the service of Nighthaunter's legacy. He has not yet learned that pain, even our own, can be savored. That fear, even when it touches our hearts, can be a delicacy. He lowered his bolt pistol slightly, the barrel no longer pointed at my chest but at my leg. "I have not come to end your story, little witness. Merely to ensure that you continue to play your part. The hunt has many more movements before its conclusion." Before I could react, he fired. The bolt shell struck my right leg just above the knee, the mass-reactive tip penetrating the flesh before detonating. The pain was beyond description, a white-hot nova that consumed all thought, all reason. I collapsed, clutching at the ruined limb, blood pouring between my fingers. "Now you understand the truth," Vorax said, his voice seeming to come from a great distance as shock began to set in. "You were never meant to escape, only to endure, to witness, to feed us with your fear." Through the haze of agony, I saw him turn and walk away, as casual as a man leaving a tavern after a satisfying meal. He had no concern that I might somehow escape, not with a shattered leg and blood pooling beneath me on the flagstones of the plaza. As consciousness began to fade, the edges of my vision darkening, I heard his final words, carried to me on the morning breeze. "We shall meet again, little witness, when you have learned to crawl." The pain eventually gave way to darkness, a mercy for which I was profoundly grateful. When awareness returned, I found myself not in the plaza where I had fallen, but in a small, dimly lit room that I did not recognize. The walls were bare rockcrete, stained with moisture and what appeared to be old bloodstains. The only light came from a single glow globe hanging from the ceiling, its pale illumination barely sufficient to dispel the shadows in the corners of the chamber. I lay on a crude pallet, my ruined leg wrapped in what appeared to be strips torn from an Imperial Guard uniform. The bandaging was inexpert but functional, the bleeding staunched, though the pain remained, a dull, throbbing reminder of my encounter with Vorax. "You are awake," a voice observed from the shadows. "Good, we have little time." A figure emerged into the dim light. A man, gaunt to the point of emaciation, his skin bearing the pallor of someone who had not seen natural sunlight in years. He wore the tattered remains of what might once have been an Imperial Guard officer's uniform, the insignia long since torn away. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice a dry rasp. "Where am I?" "My name is Dravos," he replied, kneeling beside the pallet to check my bandages. "Once captain of the 103rd Agrippanan Light Infantry. Now just another piece in their game." "You are Imperial Guard?" I asked, hope flaring despite everything I had witnessed. "Is there a regiment here, away off this moon?" Dravos laughed, a hollow sound entirely devoid of humor. "There was a regiment. 300 men and women under my command, sent to investigate when Agrippina Minor fell silent. That was 7 years ago. I am all that remains." He finished inspecting my leg and sat back on his haunches. "As for away off this moon, if there was one, do you think I would still be here? This place is their domain, their hunting ground. They control every aspect of it, from the dysfunctional Vox arrays to the sabotaged shuttle bays." I said, the name itself seeming to drop the temperature in the small room. Dravos nodded, his eyes darting nervously to the single door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. "The 8th Legion. The terror troops of the Great Crusade, now servants of darkness. They claimed this moon decades ago, after the administratum abandoned it following crop failures and corruption scandals. "Why keep anyone alive?" I asked. "Why not simply kill everyone?" "Because fear is their sustenance," Dravos replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not just the momentary terror of death, but the sustained dread that comes from living in their shadow. They are farmers of fear, cultivating it, harvesting it when it ripens." He stood abruptly, moving to a small alcove where a collection of scavenged items lay in neat rows. They allow some to survive each culling, those who demonstrate particular resilience or whose terror manifests in ways they find pleasing. We become their livestock, bred for the quality of our fear. The casual way he described their existence sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with blood loss or shock. "How many survivors are there?" "Now? Perhaps 20 scattered across the settlement. Once there were hundreds, but their appetites grow with each passing year." He selected a crude crutch fashioned from what appeared to be a damaged lasgun and a length of pipe. "This will help you move. You cannot stay here. They will be searching for you." "You saved me," I said, the realization dawning as I took the offered crutch. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Dravos looked at me, his hollow eyes momentarily flaring with something that might have been defiance. "Because every day we survive is a victory, however small. Because even here, in this hell they have created, we remain human. And humans help one another." He assisted me to my feet, or rather, my remaining foot, supporting my weight as I learned to balance on the crutch. The pain was excruciating, but manageable if I kept the ruined limb from touching the ground. "There is a network of maintenance tunnels beneath the settlement," Dravos explained, guiding me toward the door. "Constructed during the original colonization to house power conduits and water reclamation systems. They are narrow, difficult for their kind to navigate comfortably. We use them to move about, to avoid their patrols." "We?" I asked. "The survivors," he replied, carefully opening the door and peering into the corridor beyond. "Those who have learned to live in the spaces between their attention. Come, it is not far to the nearest access point." We moved through what I now recognized as the basement, a level of one of the hab blocks, a labyrinth of storage rooms and machinery spaces long since stripped of anything valuable. Dravos guided me with the expertise of someone who had navigated these passages countless times, always alert for sounds that might indicate the presence of our hunters. We reached a small maintenance room containing a rusted water purification unit. Dravos moved to what appeared to be a solid wall and pressed a specific sequence of points along a seam that I would never have noticed. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "Quickly," he urged, helping me through the opening. "They patrol this sector every few hours." The passage beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, and lit only by strips of luminescent fungus that grew along the ceiling, casting everything in a pale blue glow. The air was damp and carried the musty scent of decay, but it was blessedly free of the stench of blood and fear that permeated the settlement above. Dravos sealed the hidden door behind us and took the lead, moving with the confidence of long familiarity through the twisting tunnels. I followed as best I could, the crutch catching occasionally on the uneven floor, each stumble sending fresh waves of agony through my injured leg. "Where are we going?" I asked as we navigated a junction where 3 passages converged. "To the others," Dravos replied without looking back. "To those who still resist, in whatever small ways we can." We walked for what seemed like hours through the labyrinthine tunnels, descending deeper beneath the settlement. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thinner, forcing us to pause occasionally to catch our breath. Finally, Dravos stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall of rough-hewn stone. He placed his hand against a specific point on the wall and whispered words that I could not catch. A moment later, the wall shimmered and vanished, revealing it to be not stone at all but some form of projected image. "Hololithic concealment," Dravos explained, noting my surprise, "salvaged from the command center before they destroyed it. Primitive by Imperial standards, but effective enough against their casual scrutiny." Beyond the false wall lay a chamber larger than I had expected possible in these cramped tunnels. It appeared to have been a primary junction in the original design, expanded through years of careful excavation. Makeshift dwellings had been constructed along the walls, little more than curtained alcoves offering the barest privacy. And there were people, perhaps a dozen men and women, all bearing the same gaunt, haunted look as Dravos, all clad in scavenged clothing that had been mended and remended until the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. They regarded me with wary curiosity as Dravos helped me to a seat on a crate that might once have contained ration packs. A woman approached, her hair prematurely white despite a face that suggested she was no older than 30 standard years. She carried a battered medkit bearing the insignia of the Imperial Guard. "This is Alia," Dravos said by way of introduction. "Once our regiment's chief medicae. Now she keeps what remains of us breathing." Alia knelt beside me, unwrapping the crude bandages from my leg with practiced efficiency. She inhaled sharply when she saw the wound, a ragged crater where the bolt shell had detonated, shredding muscle and shattering bone. "Bolter wound," she observed, selecting instruments from her kit. "Clean through. Detonated after penetration. You were lucky. If it had hit bone directly, you would have lost the leg entirely." "Can you help him?" Dravos asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Alia nodded, though her expression remained grim. "I can clean it, stitch what can be stitched, and apply synth skin to prevent infection. But without proper facilities, without an autodoc or at least a surgical servitor, he will never walk properly again." "I suspected as much," Dravos said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "They rarely leave their toys intact when they are finished playing." As Alia began the painful process of cleaning my wound, I took in more details of the hidden sanctuary. Along one wall stood a makeshift shrine to the Emperor, constructed from scavenged materials. Candles made from rendered animal fat provided illumination, casting flickering shadows across a crude aquila fashioned from what appeared to be flak armor plating. Several of the survivors knelt before the shrine, heads bowed in silent prayer. Others sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes constantly darting to the chamber's entrance. The atmosphere was one of desperate faith mingled with perpetual vigilance. "How long have you been here?" I asked Dravos, focusing on his face to distract myself from Alia's ministrations. "In this chamber, I mean." "This particular sanctuary, about 3 years," he replied. "We move when we must, when they get too close to discovering us. Before this, we sheltered in the remains of the southern processing plant. Before that, the eastern hab blocks." "Always running," I observed. "Always surviving," Dravos corrected. "There is a difference. Running implies desperation without purpose. We survive with intent, with defiance. Each day we draw breath is a victory against their reign of terror." Alia finished cleaning my wound and began applying a pungent salve that numbed the worst of the pain. "This will prevent infection," she explained. "It is made from native fungi that grow in these tunnels. A gift from the Emperor in our darkest hour." "You truly believe he watches over you?" I asked, the question escaping before I could consider its impact. "Even here?" Alia's hands paused briefly, then resumed their work. "Especially here," she said softly. "Where darkness is absolute, even the smallest light shines more brightly." Dravos nodded in agreement. "Faith is our weapon, Voidsman. The one thing they cannot take from us, no matter how they hurt our bodies or torment our minds. We have seen it turn them back, seen it burn them like acid when it manifests in its purest form." I remembered the astropath, the golden light that had driven Garax from the shrine. "I witnessed something similar," I admitted, "in the shrine, with an astropath who had been kept alive by their cruelty." Dravos and Alia exchanged a glance laden with meaning. "Sarvus," Alia said. "He was with us once, before they took him. Before they found a use for his gifts that amused them more than simply killing him. He died," I told them. "He channeled something, some power that drove them back. But the effort consumed him." "A martyr's death," Dravos said, making the sign of the Aquila over his chest. "Emperor, receive him." The others in the chamber who had been listening to our conversation echoed the gesture and the prayer. In that moment, I felt something shift within me. These people, broken and hunted though they were, had not surrendered to despair. They maintained their humanity, their faith, their defiance in the face of horrors beyond imagination. "You should rest," Alia advised, finishing with my leg and wrapping it in fresh bandages fashioned from what appeared to be a shredded undershirt. "The wound needs time to begin healing, and you have lost much blood." I nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion that had been held at bay only by fear and adrenaline. Dravos helped me to a small alcove containing a pallet similar to the one I had awakened upon earlier. As he turned to leave, I caught his arm. "Why did you really save me?" I asked. "The truth this time." Dravos regarded me thoughtfully for a long moment before responding. "Because you survived the astropath's sacrifice, because you witnessed the light that hurts them, because we need someone who still believes that resistance is possible." "I am just a voidsman," I protested. "Third class, not a soldier, not a priest. None of us were prepared for this existence," Dravos replied. "We adapt, we learn. We find strength in the most unlikely places." He gestured toward my bandaged leg. "Rest now. Tomorrow, we begin your education in surviving the unsurvivable." As he walked away, I settled onto the pallet, my mind racing despite my body's desperate need for sleep. I had come to Agrippina Minor as cargo crew on a routine tithe shipment. Now I found myself thrust into a shadow war against the Emperor's fallen sons, allied with survivors who clung to faith and humanity in the face of unrelenting horror. My last thought before sleep claimed me was a simple prayer, one I had not uttered since childhood. "Emperor, protect us all, for the night is dark and filled with terrors beyond imagining." I awoke to screaming, not the distant cries of victims being tortured by the Night Lords, but immediate, desperate screams of people in mortal peril. The sanctuary was in chaos, survivors grabbing what few possessions they had and fleeing toward emergency exits concealed in the walls. Dravos appeared at my alcove, his face streaked with blood from a cut above his eye. "They found us," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. Someone broke under questioning. "They know about the tunnels." He helped me to my feet, thrusting the makeshift crutch into my hand. "The western passage is still clear. If you move quickly, you might escape the initial sweep." "What about the others?" I asked, watching as Alia hurriedly packed her precious medical supplies into a worn backpack. "We have protocols for this," Dravos replied grimly. "Scatter. Hide. Rendezvous at secondary locations if possible. But make no mistake, Voidsman, many will die before the next dawn." A distant boom echoed through the tunnels, followed by the sound of falling debris and more screams. They were breaching the tunnel network, using explosives to create entrances large enough for their massive frames. "Go now," Dravos urged, pushing me toward one of the concealed exits where other survivors were already disappearing into the darkness. "Follow them, they know the way." "What about you?" I demanded, reluctant to leave the man who had saved my life. Dravos drew a laspisol from beneath his tattered uniform, checking its charge pack with practiced efficiency. "Someone must buy time for the others, might as well be the old soldier." Before I could protest, Alia appeared at my side, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "His mind is made up," she said, her voice thick with emotion but resolute. "Honor his choice by surviving to tell of it." She pulled me toward the exit, and I found myself swept along with the flow of fleeing survivors, my protests lost amid the general panic. The last glimpse I had of Dravos was him kneeling before the makeshift shrine, laspisol in hand, head bowed in final prayer. The western passage was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing us to move in single file, hunched over to avoid hitting our heads. My progress was painfully slow, hampered by my injured leg and the awkward crutch, but the woman ahead of me, a former agricultural tech from the look of her tattered uniform, slowed her pace to match mine. "Keep moving," she urged when I paused, gasping with pain as my injured leg bumped against the tunnel wall. "If you stop, you die." Behind us, the sounds of battle reached a crescendo, then fell ominously silent. The lasgun discharges that had echoed through the tunnels ceased, replaced by a quiet that was somehow more terrifying than the noise of conflict had been. They were coming. The silence was the sound of pursuit, of predators moving with purpose toward their chosen prey. Our small group, perhaps 5 survivors including myself, emerged from the narrowest part of the tunnel into a junction where 3 passages converged. The agricultural tech, who introduced herself curtly as Mira, consulted a crude map etched onto a scrap of plasteel. "The northern passage leads to the surface near the old grain silos," she said, her finger tracing the route. "It is our best chance." No one argued. In this environment, hesitation meant death. We moved into the northern passage, our pace quickening as much as my injury would allow. The tunnel sloped upward, a good sign that we were approaching the surface. Then, from behind us, came the sound that haunted my nightmares. The measured tread of ceramite boots on the tunnel floor. The clicking of armor joints as massive forms navigated the confined space. "Run," Mira hissed, all pretense of calm abandoned. We fled, a broken, limping procession driven by pure terror. I fell behind almost immediately, my crutch catching on the uneven floor, my injured leg a dead weight that slowed my every movement. The others soon vanished around a bend in the tunnel ahead, their footsteps fading into the distance. I did not blame them for leaving me behind. In their position, I would have done the same. Survival in this nightmare realm meant making hard choices, sacrificing the few to save the many. The sound of pursuit grew louder, closer. I stumbled onward, each step a battle against pain and exhaustion. Ahead, the tunnel split, offering 2 possible routes. With no time for consideration, I chose the right-hand passage, hoping it might lead to some sanctuary, some hiding place where I might evade what followed. The passage narrowed further, forcing me to abandon the crutch and crawl on hands and knees, dragging my ruined leg behind me. The pain was excruciating, but fear provided anesthetic enough to keep me moving. I emerged into a small chamber that appeared to have once been a maintenance access point for some forgotten machinery. Rusted pipes lined the walls, and a ladder led upward to what might be a surface exit. But in my condition, climbing was impossible. I was trapped. With grim resignation, I pressed myself into the darkest corner of the chamber, clutching a jagged piece of metal pipe I had grabbed from the floor as a pathetic last defense. I had no illusions about my chances against even a single Night Lord, but I would not die without some token resistance. The sound of ceramite on stone stopped just outside the chamber. Then, with deliberate slowness, a massive form ducked through the low entrance, straightening to its full height once inside. Garak stood before me, his midnight blue armor still bearing the scars of the astropath's psychic assault. His helmet was removed, revealing the pallid, inhuman face beneath. His eyes glowed with a baleful light in the darkness, reflecting some internal corruption that had long since consumed whatever humanity he might once have possessed. "Little witness," he said, his voice holding a note of something almost like affection. "You led us a merry chase." "I will not beg," I said, raising my makeshift weapon though I knew it to be futile. "I will not give you the satisfaction." Garak smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to sharp points, like those of a predatory animal. "Your defiance is noted and appreciated. Fear seasoned with courage makes for a more satisfying feast." He moved closer, his massive form seeming to fill the small chamber entirely. "Your companions bought you time with their lives. The old soldier died well, his faith burning brightly to the end. It hurt us to look upon him in his final moments. Grief and guilt washed over me at the confirmation of Dravos's fate. He had sacrificed himself for the others, for me, a stranger he had known for less than a day. But not all who fled with you shared his courage," Garax continued, clearly savoring my emotional response. Some broke quickly under our attentions, revealing the locations of other sanctuaries, other survivors. "Why tell me this?" I demanded, anger momentarily overcoming fear. "Why not simply kill me and be done with it?" Garax tilted his head, the gesture disturbingly human, despite his monstrous appearance. "Because death is merely an endpoint. Terror is a journey. And you, little witness, have been chosen for a very special journey indeed." Before I could react, he moved with transhuman speed, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. One massive gauntlet closed around my throat, lifting me effortlessly from the ground until we were face to face, my feet dangling uselessly in the air. "You will be our voice," Garax whispered, his breath carrying the stench of blood and decay. "Our witness, the one who tells the story of Agrippina Minor to the wider Imperium, so that our legend grows, so that our name inspires fear across the stars." The pressure on my throat increased, not enough to kill, but sufficient to bring darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. As consciousness began to fade, I heard Garax's final words, a promise that chilled my soul more thoroughly than any threat could have. "We are releasing you, little witness, sending you back to your Imperium with our mark upon your flesh and our terror in your heart. And when you speak of us, as you surely will, that terror will spread, feeding us across the vastness of space itself." The darkness claimed me then, a mercy I welcomed with open arms. I awoke in a place I never expected to see again. The Medicae bay of an Imperial vessel, the steady beep of monitoring equipment, and the antiseptic smell confirming that this was no dream or final hallucination of a dying mind. A Hospitaller sister of the Order of the Cleansing Water stood beside my bed, adjusting the flow of fluids from a Medicae servitor attached to my arm. She noticed my consciousness returning and made the sign of the Aquila. "The Emperor protects," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You are safe now, Voidsman." "Where am I?" I managed to ask, my throat raw and painful, the bruises from Garax's grip still fresh. "Aboard the missionary vessel Light of His Mercy," she replied. "We found you in a savior pod that had launched from the surface of Agrippina Minor. You have been unconscious for 3 days. Memory flooded back, fragmented but horrifying. The Night Lords, the survivors, Dravos, and Garax's final promise." "The others," I said, struggling to sit up despite the sister's restraining hand. "There were survivors on the moon. Did you find any others?" The sister's expression grew solemn. "You were the only life sign detected. We performed a thorough scan of the surface before departing the system. If others survived, they were well hidden indeed. Hidden or already dead." I sank back onto the bed, grief and guilt warring within me. Had I truly been spared, or was this yet another cruel twist in the Night Lord's game? "Your injuries have been treated," the sister continued, apparently mistaking my distress for concern about my physical state. "The bolt wound was severe, but our chirurgeons are skilled. With proper therapy, you may even walk again, though you will always carry a limp as a reminder of your trial." A reminder. Yes, that was what Garax had intended. Not just the physical scar, but the psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The nightmares that would wake me screaming for the rest of my days. The constant, gnawing fear that they might find me again, might continue their lessons in terror. "We found something else in the Savior pod with you," the sister said, interrupting my dark thoughts. She reached into a pocket of her habit and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, the same one that Garax had left on the chair in the dormitory. "It appears to be addressed to you." With trembling hands, I took the parchment and unfolded it. The elegant script remained unchanged, but the message was new. "Speak of us, little witness. Tell them of the lessons we taught you, of fear as an art form cultivated and harvested by masters of the craft. Tell them that we wait in the shadows between stars, patient and eternal, and know that wherever you go, whatever sanctuary you seek, a part of us goes with you. In every shadow, in every moment of terror that wakes you in the night. We are there, feeding on your fear across the vastness of space itself. It was signed with the now familiar lightning bolt, still seeming to flicker with actual electricity on the page. The sister watched with concern as I read the message, noting the blood draining from my face, the trembling of my hands increasing until I could barely hold the parchment. "What does it say?" she asked gently. I could not share the horror of those words with her. She would not understand. No one who had not experienced the hunt could truly comprehend what I had witnessed, what I had endured. "Nothing of importance," I lied, folding the parchment and tucking it beneath my pillow. A reminder, nothing more. The sister did not press, though I could see in her eyes that she did not believe me. "The captain wishes to speak with you when you are strong enough," she said, adjusting my medication drip. "We have been instructed to return to Mandragora Tertius with all possible haste. The Ordo Hereticus has expressed particular interest in your recovery, the Inquisition. Of course they would be interested in a survivor from a moon that had vanished from Imperial records decades ago. They would have questions, they would demand answers, they would want to know everything about the Night Lords and their hunting ground, and I would tell them. Not because Garax had ordered me to spread their legend, but because the Imperium needed to know, needed to be warned, needed to cleanse Agrippina Minor with fire and faith before the corruption spread further. "I will speak with the captain tomorrow," I said, settling back into the Medicae cot. "There is much to tell." The sister nodded and withdrew, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the ever-present shadows that seemed to lurk at the edges of my vision, watching, waiting. 5 standard years have passed since my rescue from Agrippina Minor. 5 years of nightmares and cold sweats, of starting at shadows and flinching at sudden sounds. 5 years of telling my story to an endless procession of inquisitorial scribes, mechanicus adepts, and naval intelligence officers. They believe me, for the most part. The physical evidence is undeniable, after all. My shattered leg, never fully healed, despite the best efforts of Imperial medicine. The scars that cover my body, some from the crash, others from the ministrations of the Night Lords during my unconscious transport to the Savior Pod. And the mark that was discovered on the back of my neck during medical examination, a miniature rendition of the 8 Legions' winged skull, burned into my flesh at the molecular level, impossible to remove without taking my head along with it. But belief is not the same as understanding. They hear the words, record the facts, file the reports, but they cannot grasp the reality of what it means to be hunted by such creatures, to know with absolute certainty that death would be a mercy compared to the sport they make of human suffering. The Ordo Hereticus dispatched a strike cruiser to Agrippina Minor 6 months after my rescue. They found the moon exactly as I had described it, an abandoned agricultural world turned hunting ground for the traitor Astartes. But of the Night Lords themselves, they found no trace. No armor fragments, no bolt shells, nothing to confirm their presence save for the defaced Imperial shrine and the crude iconography painted in human blood across the settlement. They found bodies, of course. Dozens of them, displayed in the grotesque tableaus that were the Night Lord's signature. But of survivors, of Dravos and Alia and the others who had helped me, there was no sign. Whether they had been captured and killed, or had managed to remain hidden during the inquisitorial survey, I cannot say. I pray daily that it was the latter, though hope grows fainter with each passing year. The Inquisition eventually classified Agrippina Minor as Perditus Extremis, forbidding all travel to or communication with the moon. Naval pickets were established in orbit, with orders to destroy any vessel that approached without proper authorization. Whether these measures were sufficient to deny the Night Lords their hunting ground or merely inconvenience them temporarily, I do not know. As for me, I was granted a modest pension and quarters on an orbital station above Mandragora Tertius. My testimony was deemed valuable enough to warrant protection, but my knowledge of the Night Lord's activities made me a potential security risk, too dangerous to allow free movement through the Imperium. So here I remain, a prisoner in all but name, sharing my story with each new inquisitorial acolyte assigned to the Mandragora sector, each naval officer tasked with patrolling the quarantine zone around Agrippina Minor. I tell them of the crash, of the hunt, of Dravos and the survivors. I describe the ritual in the plaza, the astropath sacrifice, Garax's final promise. Some listen with appropriate gravity. Others dismiss my account as the ramblings of a traumatized survivor, embellished over years of retelling. It matters little to me whether they believe every detail. What matters is that the warning spreads, that the name of the Night Lords continues to inspire the vigilance necessary to combat their particular brand of horror, because they are still out there, still hunting, still harvesting fear from the vulnerable and isolated corners of the Imperium. I know this with the certainty of personal experience, with the bone-deep knowledge of prey that has briefly escaped the predator but remains forever marked by the encounter. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the artificial night cycle on this station, I hear it. The soft, rhythmic clicking of ceramite boots on hard flooring, the whisper of a voice that should not be possible across such vast distances of space. Little, witness, it calls. Our voice among the cattle. Speak of us. Feed us with your fear. And though I know it to be impossible, though multiple scans have confirmed that no traitor Astartes could possibly have infiltrated this heavily guarded Imperial facility, I find myself pressing into the corner of my quarters, clutching whatever makeshift weapon lies nearest to hand, my ruined leg throbbing with remembered pain as my heart pounds a desperate rhythm in my chest. Because this is what it means to be hunted by the Night Lords. The hunt never truly ends, the fear never completely fades, the lessons, once learned, can never be unlearned. I am Ordan Trevain, formerly Voidsman 3rd Class aboard the bulk freighter Mercator Gloriana. I am the survivor of Agrippina Minor, the witness chosen by Garax the Skinless to spread the legend of the 8th Legion among the stars. I am both victim and collaborator, both warning and weapon in their eternal campaign of terror against the Imperium of Man. And as I sit here, recording these words for posterity, for whatever poor soul is assigned to replace me when age or madness finally claims me, I offer one piece of advice, forged in the crucible of unimaginable horror and tempered by years of reflection. Fear them, respect their power and their cruelty, but never ever allow that fear to consume you entirely, for that is their ultimate victory, their final harvest. They do not merely want your terror in the moment of confrontation, but the slow erosion of your humanity through constant dread. In this, at least, I have denied them satisfaction. I feel fear, yes, every day, every hour. But I also remember Dravos, standing firm before the makeshift shrine, Laspisol in hand. I remember Alia, tending the wounded with compassion despite knowing that many would not survive to see another dawn. I remember the survivors, huddled together in their hidden sanctuary, maintaining their humanity through small kindnesses and shared faith in the darkest circumstances imaginable. These are the memories I cling to when the shadows lengthen and the sounds of phantom footsteps echo through my quarters. These are the lessons that counterbalance the cruel teachings of the Night Lords, reminding me that even in a universe drowning in horror and despair, small acts of courage and compassion remain possible. The Night Lords taught me what true fear tastes like. But the survivors of Agrippina Minor taught me something far more valuable, a lesson that the sons of Curzay, for all their sadistic genius, could never comprehend. True humanity persists even in the face of inhuman cruelty. It endures. It adapts. It finds light in the darkest places, and that, more than any weapon forged by the Adeptus Mechanicus, more than any prayer uttered by the Ecclesiarchy, more than any strategic brilliance of the Astra Militarum, is what will ultimately deny the Night Lords their final victory. They can take our lives, they can harvest our fear, but they cannot claim our souls unless we surrender them willingly. I am Ordan Trevan. I have been hunted by Chaos Space Marines. I have looked into the face of terror incarnate and survived to tell the tale. And though I still tremble at shadows, though I still wake screaming in the night, though the mark of the 8th Legion will remain burned into my flesh until death finally claims me, I can make this one declaration with absolute certainty: they did not win.